This has been one of the more difficult discussions we've organized, not because it's a difficult topic, but certainly it's not an unimportant topic, but we've struggled to find a content creator, an actor, a script writer, a director to speak about this discussion. It's not that we don't know any of them. I think we must have reached out to some 15, 20 folks. It's not that some of them haven't spoken up on this issue, but it seems that some of them don't want to talk about this issue publicly, uh, either at this time or anymore. Um, but first let me get into what the rules say. Under these rules issued by the Ministry of Health, online curated content publishers have to display an anti-tobacco health spots of a minimum 30 seconds duration each at the beginning and the middle of the program. In the middle of the program, they have to display an anti-tobacco health warning as a prominent static message at the bottom of the screen during the period of display of the tobacco products or the use in the programming. They have to display an audio-visual disclaimer on the ill effects of tobacco use of a minimum 20 seconds duration each in the beginning and in the middle of the program. And this warning message, the health spot and audio-visual disclaimer have to be in the same language as used in the online curated content that it is about. Apart from this, there's an interministerial committee consisting of representatives from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, which shall take suo moto or on the basis of complaint after identifying the publisher of the online curated content. They should issue a notice giving reasonable opportunity to the content platform to explain the failure and make appropriate modification in the content. In this case, the online curated content includes films, audio-visual programs, documentaries, television programs, serials, series, podcasts, and other such content. And publishers shall also refrain from displaying any brands of cigarettes or tobacco products or using visuals for any promotional material. So no product placement of cigarette brands. What's important is that this applies to publishers and not platforms. So user-generated aggregated platforms like YouTube or social media platforms like Facebook or Instagram, it doesn't apply there. So streaming services are in a strange situation, right? They're not broadcast, but they're regulated as if they're broadcast broadcast, or they're not movies, but they're regulated as if they're providers of movies because the content may be the same as broadcast or movies. It's as if the medium of distribution doesn't make any difference to how they're regulated. At the same time, it does appear that the platform does make a difference. So if a movie or an episode gets uploaded on YouTube, the regulations don't apply. But if the platform publishes the episodes on the same episodes, the same content on streaming services, the rules kick in. Parliament today has not passed any law in India that defines online curated content platforms, and yet now we have rules from two ministries that define and regulate these services. Another thing is that watching porn in a private space is legal in India, even though the access to porn sites was banned via ISPs by the Uttarakhand High Court. And if you remember the Union of India, and I covered this, I was in the Supreme Court, and the Kamlesh Vaswani versus Union of India case, they went out and said that they don't want to do model policing or get into anybody's bedroom to check what they're watching. So while that situation exists for porn, at the same time, content on each streaming platform is highly regulated now with two government committees overseeing its content, apart from a self-regulatory body. In fact, the self-regulatory body last week, I think on the 19th, under Justice Sikri, the retired Justice Sikri, directed for content to be taken down on a streaming platform, Ullu, for obscenity, even though the platform is not available to persons below the age of 18 years, even though it is private viewing. So, that we know things haven't been easy for streaming services and streaming service providers over the past 7-10 years. They've had several cases filed against them. The denial of anticipatory bail to Aparna Purohit of Amazon Prime Video by the Allahabad High Court was a watershed moment in a sense, because the fear of potential jail time for a company executive led to a situation where the industry weakly accepted the IT rules in the shape and form that they were made. I'm told that actually they welcome these rules because it's brought a sense of stability and protection for the industry, that there's a initial, that there are multiple steps before someone ends up going to court, and they don't just keep filing cases. But we're also seeing that that there are instances where cases can still be filed. One of the arguments I'd made during a discussion on the regulation of streaming services back in 2018 was that once you've opened the door to regulation, even by a crack, even with the self-regulated framework that was being discussed back in 2018, governments will basically get a foot in that door and like push it wide open. So following the IT rules, that's exactly what's happened, right? So if you look at social media companies, a lack of a challenge from social media companies in terms of the regulations and how they govern content on social media that go beyond the IT Act have led to the formation of first a government accountability committee, and now regulations regarding fact checking. Now in streaming, we have these regulations, which in my opinion are complete overkill, that is sort of symptomatic of a regressive and overbearing nanny state that we're becoming when it comes to the internet, where the health ministry is now saying streaming services need to show 30 seconds of content in the beginning and in the middle of a show and display these warnings. And I think it's because streaming services didn't go to court to challenge the rules. To twist and often use court, the route to restriction of our rights is often paved with the best intentions. So while the Ministry of Health might have the best of intentions with these rules, it's just another sort of overbearing regulation.
I think there's some problem with connectivity. Is anyone able to hear Nikhil?
No, I think he's
Number.
I think one minute.
Okay, I think we can go ahead with the presentation. I'll just So Koan Advisory Group and UK Awas had published a study on the effectiveness of tobacco disclaimer on OTT content services in May this year. We have Tamanna Sharma from Koan today with us, who is also one of the authors of the study. She will be presenting the paper today. Please feel free to ask questions about the study once the presentation is done. Tamanna, you can carry on.
Yeah, thanks, Saraswati. I'll just share my screen. Is my presentation visible?
Yes.
Great, thank you. So, hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me on this panel discussion. In the next 10 minutes or so, I'll be taking you through our latest report on effectiveness of tobacco disclaimers on OTT content services. I'd also like to thank Youth Ki Awaaz, who partnered with us on this research. So, to give you a quick brief on this study, what we tried to do is inspect the prevailing narrative surrounding smoking habits in India. And we attempted to shed some light on the primary factors that influence smoking behavior, while also examining the necessity of adding additional health warnings on over the top content. So, to begin with, I'd like to go over a timeline of tobacco depiction regulation in India and how it really began. So it started in May 2005, where the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare issued a notification to the COTPA amendment rules, banning the display of tobacco products and their use in any cinema or television program. Now, this notification was issued without consulting the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, which led to some pushback. It also faced some pushback from film producers like Mr. Mahesh Bhatt, who argued that these guidelines would hamper creative freedom and questioned its impact on international content, which I think also are aligned with these issues that we'll be discussing today on this panel. Now, the ban was lifted in 2011, where the government made amendments to the original rules, and they essentially brought in tobacco health spots of a minimum of 30 seconds on film and television programs that display tobacco products or their use. Together, these are called the film rules from 2011 and 2012. And from there, we now move a decade later, where we have the 2023 amendments, where the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has brought in regulation of tobacco depiction on OCCPs or OTT content platforms, requiring them to put a health spot, as Nikhil just mentioned. Also, a quick note here, I'll be interchangeably using OCCPs and OTT content platforms during my presentation, but just to be clear, I mean the same thing when I reference those terms. So looking back at this timeline, especially in the past decade, OTT platforms have gained significant popularity, and they have added themselves to the array of existing media and content consumption options for viewers. At the same time, members of civil society and several public health organizations have called for increased regulation of tobacco depiction of online curated content. So, for example, in 2020, the WHO India office released a report on tobacco imagery in collaboration with Hriday, which recommended enforcing rules for tobacco depiction across over-the-top content services. Now, an important point to note here is that most of these regulations were largely based on interactions of civil society groups with the health ministry. And what we noticed was there was an absence of industry feedback as well as consumer input. So this is what really triggered our interest on this particular issue when we started exploring existing literature. What we found was that there are existing reports. So, for example, in 2022, the ministry itself came out with the report on tobacco control in India and called for expanding COTPA's ambit to online curated services. In September 2022, another report came out that urged the ministry to take action along similar lines. Now, from our literature survey, we majorly identified three gaps that motivated us to go further into this topic. First was the absence of any direct investigation of the relationship of tobacco consumption and OTT content. There are global studies that have looked at similar relationships. For example, in our report, we have cited one study that looked at the relationship of traditional media and alcohol consumption. But even these kind of studies have largely been inconclusive. Second, we found that existing literature fails to capture consumer feedback. When you are regulating on behalf of the consumer, it is important that we take into account their perspectives and challenges, which was currently missing. And this brings me to my third point, where content regulation of digital media is largely targeted towards the younger cohorts, but fails to take into account their habits of viewpoints, which really is essential for effective implementation of these rules. So, as a starting point to our research, we looked at a cross-section of countries where content regulation links to tobacco depiction. And what we found that majority of them have targeted their interventions for young population through age verification mechanisms to ensure a safe user experience. Now, India's regulation of OCCPs under the IT rules of 2021 also aligns with this global best practice. The IT rules are sensitive towards the issue of tobacco consumption and therefore call for a higher degree of age classification of such content. So the ethos of India's regulatory measure is already in line with what other countries are doing. So as a next step to understand this issue further, we conducted a survey of about 2,000 OTT viewers. This was done in collaboration with Youth Ki Awaaz in 350 different locations across the country. And in the next couple of slides, I'll be taking you through some of the key findings of our study. So as I just mentioned, the IT rules already have measures to establish age appropriateness of online curated content. And our survey shows that there's a high degree of user awareness in this regard. So 2 out of every 3 respondents said that they're already aware of the existing age rating and content descriptors on OTT content. Next, we found that there's likely to be minimal to no impact of tobacco depiction on a person's smoking behavior. So again, 2 out of every 3 respondents said that depiction of tobacco on OTT would not influence their behavior or how they look towards smoking in any way. Interestingly, a large portion of this indifference came from non-smokers who are the main target of such a regulation. Third, we found that depiction of tobacco on TV, OTT will have no impact on encouraging smoking uptake. What we instead found that influence of peers, friends, and mental stress are some of the key factors that encourage a person to uptake smoking. In this regard, there are actually several studies that show that OTT serves as a way of leisure and is a way for people to de-stress. So it's actually a positive thing for most viewers. Now, this brings me to my next point, where 53% of our respondents agreed that additional disclaimers would impact their viewing experience. We took the minimal example of 2 sentences in a graphic, but the guidelines, as Nick has already mentioned, actually call for an audio-visual message as well as a 30-second video at the beginning and middle of each show. In addition to this, I'd also like to highlight that unlike television and theater, OTT content is a personalized viewing experience. A large majority of viewers watch OTT content on a smartphone, which typically ranges 5 to 7 inches in dimension. Now, if we add additional disclaimers to the screen in this context, it will definitely negatively impact a viewer's experience. And lastly, this brings me to my last point, that 52% respondents question the need for adding additional disclaimers, given that there are existing content descriptors and age ratings in place as per the IT rules. Now, based on the results that I've just discussed, and also coming back to my point of ensuring that regulation of online content effectively targets younger audiences, we believe that the following 2 recommendations would be the most feasible for OCCPs to consider. First is strengthening the enforcement of IT rules. So standards are only as effective as their enforcement, and it's important to maintain standardized. It's important to ensure that there is successful standards across the industry. So out of the 50 OTT services that are currently registered under the MIB, we found that not all of them are actually associated with the existing SRBs. So as I've shown here, there are 2 SRBs in place: Digital Publishers Content Grievances Council under the IMAI and the Digital Media Content Regulatory Council under the IBDF. It is important to ensure that all OTT content services operating in India are affiliated with either of these 2 existing SRBs to ensure a uniform user experience across different OCCPs, which is currently not the case. This brings me to my second point, where unlike television and theaters, OCCPs can leverage technology to introduce automated systems of age verification. And it is important to ensure high standards of age gating and age verification and moving beyond a minimal level of compliance. In our report, we have given several examples. I'll just highlight the case of UK's Ofcom, which says that self-ticking mechanisms may not be the most effective when trying to verify age. Instead, they have called for measures that include systems that can automatically verify whether a user is 18 years or not, as well as using access systems that involves some technical tools. Obviously, it's important to ensure that while introducing these changes, you have to make sure that an individual's privacy and security does not get compromised. But largely, this is what is required to ensure a high standard of age verification and age gating. Now, to sum it up, we do recognize that there's already a high degree of standardization across OCCPs when it comes to regulation. But we feel that these recommendations would help add an additional layer of high standards. With these recommendations, I'd like to conclude my presentation and would love to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Sorry, I guess my connection dropped right towards the end of what I was saying. I wanted to understand that, are there any other studies that have been done in any other countries similar to the study that you've done?
Yeah, so Nikhil, as I mentioned, from our literature review, there is no study, even in other countries, that directly looks at the relationship of OTTs and tobacco, because this is a fairly new development, right? OTTs have only gained popularity in the last decade or so. What we found that there are studies that look at the relationship of, let's say, television programs and alcohol consumption. There are studies that look at how tobacco warnings impact a user's experience. But yeah, to really come to your point, there is no direct study that has been done so far that looks at this particular relationship.
Secondly, is there a reason why especially smoking is being looked at? And there are several shows that also highlight drug consumption, right? So, I mean, literally Breaking Bad is a show that's built entirely on cooking meth. So is there any other domain that has been either A, studied, or B, been regulated for content like that? Or is smoking largely being singled out over here?
So, I mean, we have kept our focus to smoking and specifically tobacco consumption. And in our report, we've tried to highlight that there are different layers to this consumption. So first, there's tobacco, then there's smoking. There are different types of consuming tobacco. So we have particularly kept our focus on just smoking and tobacco consumption. But coming back to your point, whether there is specific regulation for smoking, I may not be the best person to comment on that, although I don't think there is.
No, I'm asking about other stuff like, for example, drug consumption, like meth, crystal meth consumption, opioid consumption. These are all things that are also shown on streaming services.
Right.
Are we seeing those warnings for that come up anywhere in the world?
Not specifically, no. So specifically for drug consumption, we have not seen any targeted intervention for those things.
Okay, and I'm just curious about what is the process by which these countries, you mentioned 4, but what is the process by which that they've gone through where they've issued certain guidelines? Like what we saw here with these guidelines is that there's literally been like zero public consumption. Zero public consultation. So have other countries gone through a public consultation process, or is it just, here, let's take guidelines for cinema, guidelines for TV, and let's copy paste them to OTT?
No, so the countries that we surveyed, most of them do consider industry consultations. And what we found was that majority of them have a very user-centric approach in their regulation. So as I've mentioned, that most of them have gone the way of age verification, and they are not paternalistic in their approach. On the other hand, the current guidelines that have come about, they seem to be, they have come without any consultation. And so, no, I think other countries have not done what we are currently doing. There has been proper consultation process.
So let's just take set streaming aside and let's look at the impact of, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head here, right? I hadn't prepared questions for this, but there are tobacco warnings at panwalas in India, right? And they have the same like gory images of lungs plastered on them. I believe cigarette packets also have them. And we've seen those like in other countries as well. And so has there been any study on the impact of let's say physical sort of display, I mean, at the location of purchase, and the effectiveness of that versus the effectiveness of having it on television or on online streaming or on cinema?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, our study has looked at this particular aspect. So there was one question where we asked users, where we gave them different factors, and we asked them, what do you think would be the most influential for you to start smoking? And so as I highlighted that on one hand, friends and mental stress are something that they said, yes, this would encourage me to uptake smoking. On the other hand, family, neighborhood, and as I mentioned, advertisements at the point of sale, which is what you are talking about, the imagery on cigarette packets, those are essentially advertisements at point of sale. They are actually discouraging factors. So yes, that particular aspect has been effective in discouraging smoking uptake. And this is something that we've also covered in our study. Whether there is a direct comparison between the two, we have not come across any such studies, but I think our research definitely adds to this point.
There's a question from Al saying that what is the behavioral insight from your study? Are policy/regulatory interventions ineffective in general? And are OTT platforms in any part of any consultation process in the Department of Consumer Affairs, for instance? I guess Ministry of Health in this case.
Yeah. So, I mean, the behavioral insight is really that, there is a high amount of user agency. People who are watching OTT content are extremely aware of what they are watching. There is awareness about age appropriateness of content. So, and the second thing is that, as our study already highlighted, most of the respondents in our survey said that watching tobacco depiction on OTT is really not going to impact their smoking behavior or how they already look at smoking. So in terms of behavioral impact, I would say the results say that it's not going to impact in any way tobacco depiction. And coming to your second point, sorry, could you just repeat that?
1 second. I think that was the point. That sorry, are the OTTs platforms part of any consultation process? They haven't been a part of the consultation process.
So far, I mean, as far as we know, and whatever is in the public, public forum, we don't think any industry has been part of this consultation.
Okay. So Dhaval is asking that the outcome of a survey mostly depends on the kind of questions asked. So, for example, whether smoking warnings come in the way of user experiences versus a question saying that, will you mind a smoking advisory for the greater good? How are these questions calibrated across surveys?
Yeah, so obviously, I recognize the point that Dhaval is making, and whenever we formulate any survey, we ensure that there is no bias from our end. So the survey questionnaire is formulated over several consultations. So we do several rounds of formulating the questionnaire, and the main focus while formulating the questionnaire is to keep the tone very neutral. So it cannot be from one aspect or the other. And that's really what our survey also made sure of.
So Prateek has asked a question that maybe not, which I've actually planned for the next session, but I'll ask it anyway. Has it been taken into consideration that you cannot skip the tobacco graphics in a cinema hall, but you can do it on the OTT platform? Many people just skip past the intro credits and jump straight into the story. Is that something that uh, that people aren't necessarily subjected to a 30-second warning. Did you consider that for your survey?
Not this particular aspect, but obviously that's a fair point. We have to recognize the difference in when somebody is watching a film on theater and OTT content. And this is a fair point, and it really is one of the questions that needs to be asked when you are, putting up guidelines for adding additional disclaimers. But no, we did not specifically dive into this particular aspect.
Okay. Aswari has asked, as mentioned in the presentation, it is clear that the behavioral impact is almost zero. Then do you agree with tobacco warnings at all? Do you agree that a simple pop-up can be cancelled by the user during a movie? Does that also help to follow the regulations and keep the movie going? Would that work?
Yeah. So, I'd just like to clarify, the point of the study is not to question tobacco warnings. That's really not what the focus is. We only specifically focused on whether there is a need to add additional disclaimers. So we recognize that tobacco consumption is obviously an issue, and we are in line with whatever government thinks is the best way to go about addressing these concerns. But our study specifically focus on whether there is a need for additional disclaimers in place.
Okay, I've got last two questions. I'll rush through them because we need to start. 1 second. Are user surveys a good measure for the study? It's surveys is asking, I feel that viewers might think that they're not being influenced by smoking on screen, but behaviorally they might be. Shouldn't that be another design to study cause and effect in this? Shouldn't that be another aspect to study in terms of cause and effect? That people may not say that they're affected, but actually they might be affected.
Right. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, whenever you are bringing about any regulation on behalf of the consumer, if you don't take into account their perspectives, their challenges, their viewpoints, then the effectiveness of these guidelines really comes into question. So that's really something that we identified, and we felt that there is a need for a user survey. Whether there would be a bias, yes, there might be a bias, but any sort of survey and analysis does factor those biases into account. So whatever results we come up with, the methods that we use for our analysis already factor these biases into account.
Understood. One second. So I think we'll just, I think we've answered this question, the last one, but we need to move on to the next session. Tamanna, thank you so much for sharing this presentation with us. We'll put a link to this, to the survey results in chat. Tamanna, it's okay that in case anyone wants to get in touch with you for a copy of the survey, if we can connect you.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
All right, great. Thanks. Thanks, Tamanna. I'll hand over to Saraswati.
Thanks, Nikhil. Thanks, Tamanna. We'll move on to the panel discussion. We have on the panel Arundeep, Principal Correspondent, The Hindu, Gauri Gokhale from Nishit Desai Associates, Tavni Indlaw from Sai Krishna and Associates, and Rakesh Maheshwari, former Senior Director and Group Coordinator, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology.
Mr. Maheshwari is here, so and he has to leave early. So I'll start with him. So thank you so much for joining us. You were someone who architected the IT rules in 2020, and that included an age-related disclaimer, and it had smoking-related disclaimers. Do you think there was a need for these rules in addition to what you had done?
See, my view is the intent per se, I mean, I don't challenge the intent. Intent appears to be okay. And maybe there is an attempt by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare to bring parity with respect to theaters. Having said so, I completely agree that you need to follow a process in the government, particularly whenever any new subordinate legislation or amendment to a subordinate legislation is brought in. So that means, as has been conveyed by Tamanna, it appears, and also by you, it appears that maybe no such consultation with the stakeholders or public consultation has been done. More so, particularly because this rule is to be implemented through the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. I do believe, and I agree with the point that such consultation should have been done and probably could have brought the intended, I should say, insertions or maybe whatever was the intent of conveying that the tobacco or use of tobacco products is harmful. So the focus should have been on the solution rather than the way it needs to be conveyed in the OTT program. Now, having said this, I will now like to, dwell upon the difference between what is there in the theater versus what is there in the OTT platforms, or what is being consumed through the OTT platforms. One, of course, in the theater, you go with a mindset. And normally it's a movie of, let's say, around 2 hours. And therefore, spending 2 minutes, 5 minutes, or maybe you can always design when to reach when the movie starts. So you are mentally prepared for what is there. In the OTT scenario, the remote is always with you. You always have a choice what to see, what not to see. And therefore, if there is, by design, if you know that there is going to be a 30-second or followed by another 20 seconds of maybe program to be shown, or something which they have seen all the time, they will like to skip it. The duration of the program also on the what you are seeing can be small, can be big, can be something which has already been there for years together. So per se, comparing OTT directly with the what you see in theater may not be appropriate. And I do believe, if with your recommendations, I do strongly believe that there is a need to interact further with the ministry, MOHFW, as well as MIB, and to see that while the desired impact is achieved, the means need to be reviewed. So this is one aspect which maybe I wanted to convey. And second part is that, of course, there are smaller players, there are bigger players. So just putting everybody and measuring everybody with the same stick also may not be proper. And lastly, see, Tamanna has also mentioned that why you are seeing this kind of programs. Or maybe what is the mood when you are looking at consuming the OTT program. So that's one part. Second part, of course, is that you are paying for it. So when you are subscribing, for example, if I'm subscribing to a particular channel, it's quite possible that I'm wanting to look for an ad-free kind of an scenario. Now, if there are such ads brought in for tobacco, maybe possibly tomorrow you may think of bringing in some new kind of material to be brought in because of the statutory requirements. So the precedent is wrong, and this is what needs to be corrected. Once again, I will like to conclude that maybe different and innovative means of fulfilling the intent should have been the motto, rather than just communicate it, that without hopefully, I mean, the consultation process, which is part of any government making. Thank you. Am I audible?
So I think my connection is having a problem. So I was just wondering whether, one of the things that we're seeing is a need for impact-driven policy making or impact assessment-driven policy making, evidence-based policy making. I was just wondering about whether you're aware of any impact assessment that has been done or any evidence that has been used by the ministry in formulating these regulations. I mean, if you look at even with MIghty and the plans on the Digital Competition Act, there is a call now for evidence-based policy making. So are you aware of any evidence collection that we may not be aware of?
No, that's what it appears, that maybe such a study has not been done. And in fact, I do believe, I mean, if there is any study which is available and convey as to how, why we are making these changes, that means there has to be a dialogue, ideally before the changes are made, before the amendments are conveyed. But even when the amendments have already been conveyed, there has to be a better communication between the ministry and the stakeholders. And maybe listen to, and there SRBs are also there. So there is a level 2, which is an institution which is also available, and they also should be in a position to maybe convey their views, and definitely they act as an interface between the OTT platforms and the government. To that an extent, they would have also been a very good, I should say, stakeholder in this particular case, and their views could have been useful.
So what are your views? Yes.
Yeah.
So what are your views on the creation of two different government committees here? I mean, tomorrow I wonder if, for example, like in The Godfather, you had a horse's head being, a cut off horse's head being shown on screen, and it could be a move to prevent cruelty to animals again. And, a relevant ministry would also set up its own committee regarding treatment of animals. You could have regarding narcotics, another committee set up for guidelines. So I'm just saying that
I agree.
Is there no conversation that happens between ministries about these level 2s?
I'm sure conversation must have happened, but definitely maybe because the act belongs to, or act is administered by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. Maybe it is in light of that the amendment has been carried out. But I definitely agree that particularly when the content is being managed or regulated by the Ministry of I&B in the OTT space, maybe there could have been some press communication or otherwise also some communication or maybe stakeholder discussion from Ministry of I&B side also could have been. So important is to gain trust and confidence of the people, of the stakeholders. And this is what probably is missing in this particular case.
So, in fact, that's a great point that you bring up, and I'll stick with you for a little bit. So, because I know you have to leave, you're in the middle of a workshop, but one of the attendees has asked this question. Anupam Sanghi has asked that: is there a lack of trust in self-regulation? Would a robust self-regulatory board help to gain the trust of the government and the consumers rather than new rules all the time?
So, as I said, the process could have been more transparent, that's all. So otherwise, there is no question. At the end of the day, governments do work collaboratively. And in this case also, there should have been a confidence building measure before any such rule comes out. Maybe because it just happened on the tobacco day, or might have been planned, but maybe because of a specific day coming into, or there being a specific day, maybe there was a hurry in releasing the rules. But as I said, I mean, in the beginning itself, the intent is correct. The process is what probably.
But sir, even if you go back to the IT rules, the MIB part of those rules was also not up for public consultation. I know that there were 2-3 meetings that were held with
Consultations
industry
were done with OTT
stakeholders,
platforms. Yeah.
but not a public consultation as is, I believe required under the rulemaking process.
Yeah. So I'll personally not like to go into those details, but I'm sure as far as the Ministry of Electronics and IT is concerned, we did go in for the consultations. We did share all the feedback which was received at that particular time. Of course, because of the PDP bill also having some bit of overlap, that maybe we were in fact tracking what were the progress which was happening in the PDP bill in the parliament, but were not really able to have further discussion because of the overlap. As regards the MIB part, consultations did take place, particularly, I mean, with the VOD and AVOD, I mean, the VOD based OTT platforms. I'm not really sure whether the consultations did take place with the online news platforms also or not. But once again, the intent remains the same, that anything and everything, I mean, which you, I mean, wish to bring in the public domain, and which impacts not only the stakeholders in terms of the industry, but also the users. There should always be a reasonable public consultation to create confidence in all the stakeholders.
So, and maybe so also as a part of information and evidence gathering, not just creating confidence. But sir, I was just on a more philosophical note, there is a very clear in the IT rules and an age gating display that is required. There are also age gating mechanisms which streaming services have. However, they may or may not be very effective, but there is even the study that Kwan and Youth Ki Awaaz had done, it said about improving age gating mechanisms. But let's for a minute say that addressing age gating has been done. Under those circumstances, shouldn't grown-ups be allowed to be grown-ups and essentially take their own decisions around what they watch in a purely private space? Because this is not public viewing, this is private viewing on your own device in your own room. And so should the state really be getting into people's bedrooms and addressing how they're viewing content?
Once again, please understand the state's objective. So even when you are, say, for example, going and watching maybe a movie which has been rated A, the same kind of, I should say, advertisements and messages are communicated even in a theater. So it's not that when you are mature or when it is 18 rating or maybe it is 16 rating, that maybe you don't have to be informed. So it is always desirable to inform. There is also, I do believe, as you have conveyed, I mean, and you have rightly conveyed, that maybe platforms also need to look back as to how effective their system of age gating is, particularly because at least I have not been able to see as to how effective it is. And if I'm not able to see and utilize this particular feature, maybe many of the people who are subscribing to the OTT platforms may not be able to use it. And to that an extent, there is a need to once again engage. In any case, rules have not really become effective as yet. So time has still not, I mean, it has not still, things, it's not that the things have just been carved out in stone. I always believe there is a possibility to relook, once again, engage with the ministry, engage with both the ministries, Ministry of I&B and Ministry of Health, and to see that what can be the best possible scenario. Of course, there are studies which you have already done that go along with these studies and maybe convince and try to convince as to the goal should be met, not the process part.
So I understand that the intent is to warn people about the negative impacts of tobacco. But there are also other instances like I said, drug abuse, animal cruelty.
Yeah,
Now,
correct.
so
So-
how do you deal with this plethora of and so
so first, so
there are, for
so-
example, evil characters that are shown doing evil things in shows in all the time. That is a part of the creative process. So then will we be seeing guidelines like warnings after warnings after warnings in every scene that
No.
we see at some point in time?
So one thing is, of course, you are segregating it through the age gating. Second is, particularly with respect to the illicit drugs and the kind of drugs that you mentioned in the beginning. See, because unless they have been specifically mentioned in the program, there is once again no need of unnecessary showing certain warnings also. But maybe it's an attempt by the ministry to create awareness about the ill effects of certain products which are widely used and particularly are shown in the context in the programs which are shown in the context as if it is the dada who is trying to use and maybe whoever is using the tobacco products is probably shown to be more masculine. So that is where I do believe once again that the means are, this is what should have been particularly reviewed, particularly because the programs are of various duration and the user has the flexibility all the time. So if you are killing or if you are not allowing user to be maybe skip, that also creates a negative sentiment and the user will always have the ability to flip to other program, which is not the case of theater. So while some sort of an equivalence has been tried to be done, it has to be seen that it is not exactly the equivalence which you have really been able to achieve. And that is where my point once again remains that there is a need to once again engage with the corresponding ministries to be able to convey your point, and let's hope it works.
So I know I've asked you some challenging questions, so thank you so much for taking time to join us.
Thank you.
Really
And
appreciate
sorry,
it.
sorry, I took my turn out of the way and I'm leaving also now. So thank you very much, Nikhilji, and all my fellow panelist members, Gauri Gokhleji. So
Great, sir.
thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Yeah,
really appreciate it.
Good.
So we'll move on to the panel discussion now. I'll hand it over to Saraswati and I'll jump in as well. Thanks.
As we're talking about user experience, I'd like to ask a question to Arun. So as a consumer of streaming services, do you think there's any justification for these rules? And should there be anti-smoking ads in the beginning of every episode that you're watching, and if it includes smoking scenes?
Yeah, so I've been watching, I've been a consumer of not just streaming, right? Like all of us, I have also been someone who goes to the cinema a lot and sometimes watches TV. And it has been, I think, almost a decade now that we've had statutory warnings for smoking on TV and in cinemas. And I can tell you it doesn't get easier to get used to. I am particularly sensitive to censorship issues, but those warnings are very intrusive. They take away from your immersion in the scene. They take away from what the creator is trying to convey in that particular moment. We had this really nice episode back in 2012 where right before the labeling restrictions for cinema were in place, Shah Rukh Khan had to go personally to the censor board to convince them that, hey, this is a bad guy. So if he smokes, it's not really moral behavior. He turns out to be evil at the end, and so on and so forth. And they accepted that into the justification. I mean, the fact that it turned out to be a problem in the first place was also a little worrying. But yes, as someone who is a consumer of OTT content now, a lot of the content that has smoking in it is also classified with no mature ratings. And I think Bachche Bigad Jayenge has been a very big foundation for the justification of this law, and also initiation for adolescents and slightly older people. But I think we have put in a system in place, the IMD ministry has, for better or worse, to standardize age classifications. And if I feel like it is disrespectful to both that system as well as viewers to add on these visually intrusive factors as well. One example I will end with this is that, for example, when Shantaram released here, it was obviously rated with its highest maturity rating A. It had a few disclaimers in the beginning, but it said, hey, this show this depicts smoking and all sorts of drug abuse, and these things are injurious to health. It was a simple message. It was only in India that they had this. But I think there are proportional ways to do this without hitting out at user experience. Saraswati, you're on mute.
Sorry. I was asking, since the MIB has already issued guidelines, I mean, I think even IT rules have provisions for classification of content. So was there any need to, include these separate guidelines as well?
From the reporting that I have done, it turns out that the IMD ministry was last in the loop in, I think, 2 years ago. And when the notification came out, they found out with the rest of the world. And obviously, the overlapping jurisdiction does create a bit of, it raises a few eyebrows, right? But we have to remember that this is not without precedent. The Quadpa amendment was, or the previous Quadpa amendments for TV and for cinemas were brought out by the health ministry. I'm not sure at that stage what level of cooperation existed between the IMD ministry. It may be the case that the bureaucrats in the IMD ministry were a little skeeved that, hey, why are these guys coming into our territory? But in both those previous cases, the outcome was the same. The IMD ministry did not intervene in the application of the rules. And I suspect that might well be the outcome here as well, that they see that this is not entirely respecting the administrative authority that each ministry or department has been given, but that the cause is so much that the stakes are just not in the favor of intervening.
So this is like a perfect segue for Gauri. Gauri, I'm just wondering, that it's Arun said that these guidelines are essentially, they've been functional for a while for television and cinema and as well. And I think he indicated without challenge, but are these really without challenge? Has there been a verdict over here regarding how cinema and TV would be regulated?
Sure. So thanks, Nikhil. Thanks for inviting me. And, there has been a checkered past on this entire piece, right? Regulations. And back in 2005 also, the Bombay High Court sort of ruled and stayed the amendments to the rules, which basically were brought out for television, right? But unfortunately, for some technical reasons, and the Supreme Court basically, on the basis that the Bombay High Court order was almost ex parte, right? And then they stayed the Bombay High Court order. So just to give a quick background, in 2003 when the act came in, and the rules followed by that, the act and the rules both were challenged in the Bombay High Court. right? And then there was a stay. Now the question arises is why were they challenged, right? And so I'll come to that in a bit, but just to complete Nikhil's point, even later on when the rules were amended, again there was a challenge, and then the Delhi High Court actually stayed some of the rules, right, for television. But unfortunately, even that order was stayed by the Supreme Court of India, and that is why for both theaters and television, those rules continue, but the petitions are pending. So they are not final concluded decisions. These are interim orders by the Supreme Court, but the challenge to the rules that were the act and the rules are still pending before the Bombay High Court and Delhi High Court, right? So
So which
that
are
is,
these cases?
yeah. So there are 2-3 cases. I'll just sort of call that out. So one is the Bombay High Court case was I'm just reading it out. It's a writ petition of 1234 of 2005 and writ petition 2472 of 2005, right? So these were the two petitions. And then when the matter was in the Supreme Court, that was the matter which was of, which is the matter, there were two petitions, as I said, and then there was a Sridhar Kulkarni matter in Bombay High Court. And then the matter where it was stayed before the Supreme Court, that is the Health for Millions versus Union of India. So that's an NGO which appealed to the Supreme Court, and in that is the order where it was stayed. And later on, where Mr. Anurag Kashyap, in the ugly matter, tried to again challenge the amendment to the rules before the Bombay High Court. There also, unfortunately, the Bombay High Court said because of that, old ruling of the Supreme Court, once again, they did not intervene in that particular amendment to the rules, right? So, I mean, I am happy to share, all these details. Maybe my, my colleague can send you the link of all the cases. So this is the background, unfortunately, of these matters. Now, why was it challenged? Let us look at that. If, Nikhil, if you don't mind, I'll just spend 2 minutes on the challenge part, right? So the original act itself was challenged as unconstitutional, and the rules were challenged as ultra virus and unconstitutional both, right? So if you really see the constitution, the health, subject comes in the state ministry, right? Under, entry 6 in the state list. Now, what the union has done, they have invoked entry 52 of the union list. And that is why if you see section 2 of the act, which you can, correlate that, because the union list says that industries, the control of which by the union is declared by parliament by law to be expedient in public interest. So here they are talking about controlling the industry. So they said that, we want the industry, which is the tobacco industry, to be controlled through this act in public interest, right? And then they talk about, because of that, we are legislating. Now, interestingly, there was another case in Goa where the state legislature tried to also, legislate on tobacco. They said state also has legislative powers because of that entry 6 of the state. So, there is that overlapping issue. And the other issue from a ministry perspective, which was brought out before, under AOBR, health, of course, comes under health ministry. And they have something called Health National Mission, under which again there is a tobacco, tobacco as one of the identified entries for that particular health mission, national health mission, right? So these are the sort of overarching AOBR, which is allocation of business rules, under which health ministry is claiming their jurisdiction, read with, entry 52 of the union list. But my question is slightly different, right? The whole purpose of the act is on advertising and sale of cigarette, right? It is the advertising issue. If you see section 5 also, it is advertising. The question is, how can you say where there is no brand being shown in any of the scenes that it is amounting to advertising? And how can you invoke the advertising related provision for the purpose of general display of the tobacco products? Right. So that is the point I'm making on the ultra virus point. And under section 31 of the act also, I don't see any powers to legislate or, in a delegated legislation to go beyond beyond the purpose of that, which is the advertising part, right? And the sale to children and all that, which is okay. So
No,
my
but
point,
counterpoint is that for example, the tobacco industry could easily say put together like a consortium and an industry body. That industry body could pay for showing general smoking on on and could even create general smoking ads, and that will benefit the whole industry in a sense, right? By encouraging people to smoke in a sense. So that's
so
the fact that it's
I
not a
mean,
brand is a different issue.
no, but what I'm trying to say, this is advertising has a certain connotation when you look
Correct,
in a general parlance. So
correct. But this is
whether
not
or not
advertising.
it is, the when you're sort of in the depiction, is
Hmm.
it advertising itself? I mean, I'm just making I mean, if the act was drafted in a particular way, I can understand, but the act was drafted focusing on advertising. And that is where I'm saying that in my mind, whatever is being trying to be controlled is not advertising as understood generally. I mean, that I understand, Nikhil,
Huh,
where you are coming from. Yeah, but
No, but
yeah,
in fact, you're right. Like it's not, none of it is advertising. And
right.
in fact, what you're seeing is that there's an anti-tobacco advertising which is being inserted. So that also seems to be beyond the remit of the
Yeah.
law, right?
Yeah,
But
that's what I think. Unfortunately, these matters are pending. There are only interim orders, but that is my personally, when I revisit the entire scheme of things, unfortunately, those matters, should have been heard by now, but the Indian system. So yeah.
Thanks. Savni, the rules say that display of anti-tobacco health spots of minimum 30 seconds at each at the beginning and the middle of the program. But they also say that display an audio-visual disclaimer on the ill effects of tobacco use of minimum 20 seconds duration each in the beginning and middle of the program. What is the difference between a health spot and an audio-visual disclaimer? And does it mean that we'll end up having like uh, 30, like 60 and 40, like 100 seconds of disclaimer, like 100 seconds of disclaimers in every show?
Yeah, so Nikhil, on this health spot and audio-visual disclaimer, and it seems to be that these rules have taken various parts from various existing rules that we already have. So this portion about health spots, audio-visual disclaimer, it's sort of identical to what they wanted to introduce when they talked about the disclaimers and the health spots for the films and in cinema. And similarly, when they talk about who has to implement these rules, they've gone and directly copy pasted that from the IT rules. So to answer your question, yes, essentially that's what it means, because when health spot, when looked at from the point of view of theaters, cinemas and theaters, are those ads that you see in the beginning, which the government has created, the Mukesh ad being the most popular one. And then when you talk about audio visual disclaimer, those are the blank screens, the black screen with the white text that sort of is a disclaimer, which is both audio and visual. So in this case, it is an audio and visual disclaimer that comes in. And to answer your question, yes, that means that for maybe a 20-minute program, you'll probably have 100 seconds in the beginning and 100 seconds at the end, which talk about tobacco and tobacco use. And as you had already mentioned, and Gauri also sort of touched upon it, that one may wonder that if showing smoking without a brand is an advertisement, then in a 20-minute episode, having 4 or 5 minutes of just disclaimers also in turn becomes an advertisement instead of a detriment to tobacco use.
That's actually like, what's the difference in terms of regulating cinema, TV, and OTT services? Like, are the rules different for each of them? Are the regulations different for each of them? And like the same content may be shown in all three, right?
Yeah.
So should the rules that apply to cinema apply to OTT, or should the rules that apply to TV apply to OTT? Or has the ministry just been lazy and copy pasted the rules?
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. And in fact, doesn't this bring us to the whole point? And I'm not going to touch upon the legality and validity of the IT rules for a minute here. We can come back to that. But isn't that the whole point of why we came about? We said, okay, let's have digital and media ethics code, and why that's a separate regulation altogether. Why in all of these petitions that were pending before courts, the government itself has come in and said, no, the MEITY does not look at online content, or sorry, the MIB does not look at content on the internet. That's not within the realm of the MIB. Initially, that's the stand that they had taken, and that the Cinematograph Act won't apply to content online. The reason for this is that the way content is consumed in theaters is different from the way the content is consumed in on television, and it's different from how it is consumed on the internet. And I'll go back to what you said at the beginning of this session, which is that in effect, I may decide to watch a web series in one go overnight. I'll watch, say, 8 to 20 episodes of 20 minutes, 1 hour each. Now, how many times within that time period am I supposed to watch the same disclaimer and watch the same health spot again? And as Mr. Maheshwari already touched upon, when you're going to the theater, you've made that sort of connection of I'm going for 2.5 hours with so much time being spent on actually watching the content. So to answer your question, yes, it has to be different because the way I'm consuming the content is different when it comes to each of these media. And here, what it seems, just adding my 2 thoughts, it seems that the state is sort of passing on its burden onto the private players and saying, look, the objective that we are trying to achieve is ensuring that the youth is not going towards more consumption of tobacco. We're going for a tobacco-free nation, but they're targeting what seems to be the lowest common denominator instead of actually looking at tobacco sales and actual tobacco consumption. They're not really looking at the studies, as Tamanna has mentioned, where whether or not this would actually impact tobacco use. They seem to be passing on that burden and saying, no, everybody today watches OTT content. Let OTT content providers follow the same path as other entertainment content providers are following.
Arun, how should these regulations apply to content? 10-minute shorts are different from a show with a season of 8 20-minute episodes or 13 episodes of an hour each, and a 1.5-hour movie and a 3-hour movie. Do you think there should be any difference and how would that work out?
Well, that's a tricky question to ask me because I don't think the rules should have existed at all. But there are shows like Love, Death and Robots on Netflix where some episodes are like an hour long and some episodes are 10, 13 minutes long. You have a smoking shot in that episode and you're done. That episode is no longer a watchable piece of content. You have 30 seconds in the beginning, 5 minutes into the episode, you have another 30 seconds of warnings, and then for that short, whatever. It is spoilage, right, to a huge extent. And it is just if I can just go into a bit of a sidetrack here, I feel like this distinction between something that we have that we watch at home, push versus full content. I think a lot more work needs to go into establishing that distinction jurisprudentially, because as we see it, the IT rules on paper seem to respect that distinction, but the government's posture doesn't. And now even the
I would actually completely disagree with that. If you look at it,
being inconsistent with,
look at what Mukul Rohgi said in the High Court, in the Supreme Court, Court number 1, Kamlesh Vaswani case, and I was there and we reported it. He says that we don't want to do moral policing, don't want to get into anyone's bedroom. This is private viewing. It's push. It's content that people are signing up, like pulling essentially. And so he made that distinction.
Yeah,
but then the thing is that the streaming industry essentially gave that up when they accepted the IT rules without challenging them, right?
Yeah,
so it doesn't. It's not that the IT rules make an acceptable distinction there. They don't look at it really as pull, do they?
Absolutely. And we should also be cautious about the positions taken by attorneys general from time to time in court, because when Rajiv Gandhi was called, a fattu on sacred games, the government produced such a beautiful affidavit defending freedom of speech. And that is a very memorable but forgotten document from the initial days of the Wild Wild West, when streaming services were actually making the things that creators wanted to make. And after Tanda, that posture completely changed. I think porn in particular has been at the fringes of public discourse. And when that happens, individual agendas and individual impulses for more freedom can take over a little more easily. And I think that is why it is important to carve that legal protection for yourself, that jurisprudential air gapping from such interference when you have the opportunity to do so. And the fact that it is not even happening now, right? When the administrative authority, the IMB ministry, is itself not in favor. It's not directly in favor. There is no public will. There is no political capital that has gone into an actual cabinet minister making public telecasted remarks on this amendment. I think the circumstances couldn't be more perfect and the stakes couldn't be higher. And we are still seeing a very recessive posture. I think that's very disappointing.
Gauri, do you think the more needs to be done on push versus pull? Or is that now too late?
No, I think somewhere there was, because I remember that when MIB started looking at it, in fact, our firm had published a report and presented, when MIB requested us to do so, that is where the conversation started on push versus pull, but some more evidence-based approach could help. But at the same time, I feel on this specific issue, in my mind, I think forget push versus pull or anything, even for television, whether theater or even for that matter on now on OTT.
What about public versus private?
See, any of this, I can understand more from a nature of content which will arise to, some kind of public order issue, right? That was the whole genesis of, your sort of pre-certification issue, when you're watching content together in a theater. That was the whole thought process where it started, that you need some kind of controls when people are sitting together, and then how is the likely reaction, and then there were the controls, right? But there has been a different thought process and there have been public conversations that we need to revisit this entire concept of how the freedom of speech should be controlled. In this specific case, I would even challenge the way they require in theaters, whether push versus pull, public versus private. Is there an evidence to demonstrate the effectiveness of these warnings in the first place, whether in theaters or on television? In fact, there is a 2017 report which says that television industry has not properly implemented and all of that. So there was some study around that. My question is, has anybody conducted study to see the effect of these kind of warnings in the first place? Because now we are moving more towards empirical based data and the proportionality, right? So when you talk about any regulations after the Supreme Court ruling on crypto, which in fact our firm had handled, the proportionality nobody is talking, right? Because the proportionality. So when we are talking about proportionality, what is the object sought to be achieved and the measure taken, right? With vis-a-vis that objective, I'm putting it very simply, because I'm sure there are non-lawyers also in the audience. So if you see the impact, and that is where I'm saying empirical data is required. Now just imagine, as even Sarvani pointed out, all these measures for a platform, right? To put it before the before and after, then put in between. There is foreign content. There is so much foreign content which is available on the platform. We may or may not be even watching that, but technically, because I can watch that, that means you have to make changes through and through. So imagine the amount of effort that is going to go in, the proportionality of that versus the mischief that you're trying to control or regulate. And if there are other measures available to achieve the same objective, have you explored what are the other measures? Just to give an example, national education policy. Does your policy say that, okay, in schools do this education, right? What I'm trying to say, you can even request the industry, why don't you come out with very creative, content that is available to general public to, educate them on the ill effects of, tobacco. Why do you want there and there message when people are distracted? In fact, people are distracting and wanting to watch content. You're pushing this where nobody want to pay attention to that content. Give some creative solutions to, pass on your message. Right. So what I'm trying to say is, what is the overall objective, right? And the manner in which you're trying to implement is actually not working together.
I mean, if you think about it, it's not mandatory for movie theaters now to play the national anthem anymore, right? Even there, it's become optional for theaters whether they want to put it or not. Fair enough. I'll come to Sabni, but Arun, just taking up from what Gauri was saying, is there like how? Sorry, I lost my trail of thought.
Do you mean to ask how like practical it is to do this?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, exactly. Is it practical? Like she was talking about how I mean that vast amount of content library.
Okay. So I'll take a bit of a counterpoint here. It's very practical because it is. I'm not saying impractical. It's very practical. It is possible to do this. Maybe not in 3 months. That extension can be negotiated. It has been successfully negotiated for previous legislations like this. Let's say with the IT rules, where the social media companies needed a few more months. That's not going to be an issue. I mean, I crunched some numbers very clumsily. Netflix has 36,000 something hours of content in the US. And let's say you pay triple the highest hourly minimum wage in the world to have people sift through that content and mark each shot, whether it has smoking or not. And let's say you have 1 lakh hours instead of 36,000 hours. And the cost still comes out to something like $3 million. And they are not going to go to the place with the highest minimum wage to do this. They're going to come to Infosys, right? That they will be trying to cut corners in the cost of doing this everywhere. So the cost will come down to $1 million. And after that, this is the one-time expense, because for following titles, the digital supply chain is so vast and complex. A Korean drama lands here with Hindi dubs on day one. It lands with subtitles in 20 languages around the world on day one. That is nothing. I mean, smoking warnings, to add them from now on is not a technically challenging task. So I think we should not underestimate how capable the industries around the world are of pulling off something like this, which is why it is all the more scary that the resistance is coming on that front. Hey, give us a little more time, let's talk a little bit more, because that kind of makes me feel like it might end up happening.
Perhaps there's another aspect which you might have missed, and I'm just wondering about the effectiveness of this also. The rules state that the warning message, health spot, and audio-visual disclaimer shall be in the same language as used in the online curated content. So if I'm watching a Korean drama where someone smokes, the disclaimer will have to be in Korean. And so then for every language that you add on, your disclaimers will have to also be in different languages.
I'm a bit of a Netflix buck, so I think Netflix will do it very well. They will sync the warnings with the subtitle language. I think they'll figure out something. But yeah, I mean, that is also like a bit of a confusing thing. Now they'll have to do this in like 100 languages. You will have French.
I'm just wondering, Gauri, Savni, if I'm watching a Korean drama in Korean with subtitles, or if I'm watching a Norwegian drama in Norwegian with subtitles, the disclaimer will not be in my language.
Yeah,
the initial portion, the 30-second AV will not be in my language.
So picking up on what Gauri was saying, that's the point that I was also trying to make. See, just taking forward the whole idea of proportionality and is this even effective? When you talk about, on the one hand, the conversation over the last 1 year has been on increasing accessibility. We've had the petition in the Delhi High Court. We've had the amendment that talks about increasing accessibility. Part of it is having subtitles. Then you are saying impose, have these anti-tobacco health warnings, which will most likely, when you're watching on a small screen, let's be real, if it's on a television, it's different. When you're watching on a small screen, your subtitle will come on top, your health warning will come on top of your subtitle. How do these objectives of reducing use of tobacco, but at the same time increasing accessibility. And how do all of these go hand in hand? And then exactly the point that you are making. While Arun, I agree with you, they'll probably sync it with the language of the subtitle, but that's not what the rule says. The rule says that it shall be in the same language as used in the online curated content. So Nikhil is right. If it is a Korean drama and you're watching with subtitles, then your health warning, which is in Korean, is coming on top of the English subtitle that you are watching. So neither you understand the show nor you understand the health warning. And where does that lead us? So I completely agree with you, Nikhil. And
maybe you'll have health warnings with subtitles.
yeah, and so this is where the whole idea of having some conversation with somebody who knows how the industry works may have helped to really sit down and understand whether or not this is going to achieve the objective that they are trying to achieve, which certainly doesn't seem like it is right now.
Just one small thing to add to that. Since the video warnings have to come from the Ministry of Health, they will now have to, the OTT industry will go there and be like, yeah, give us some Korean health warnings that we can put on our website.
Yeah, for all you know, you have tenders for translators for health warnings and health spots. I mean.
So, Sapni, what about forwarding or skipping? They do I think that's something which Mr. Maheshwari also mentioned. So, will we have the option of skipping them? Is it legal for platforms to allow skipping and forwarding? How can we interpret like the words display sort of in terms of beneficial legislation for the larger public? Like, will we mandatorily have to watch it, or can we skip it?
So see, there is, I mean, the rules are silent, right? But let's be real. As we discussed, this is a beneficial legislation. When you talk about a beneficial legislation, they have to interpret it in favor of the legislation and in favor of the objective being sought to be achieved by the legislation. That is point number one, which is why, although let's be real, how as they have complained that television channels have not implemented the rules as they had to be. OTT platforms can also implement it, have an option to skip it and wait for somebody to come and say this is not being implemented the way it was supposed to be. But if I were to think about how this would be interpreted in court, possibly because it is a beneficial legislation, one would say that no, you cannot give the option to skip it. And where I would read that within the wordings of the rule is the fact that it uses the word display and not something like include or add and so on. When you say display and you have to read it with the language of proposed rule 11 itself, which says rule 11.1, every publisher of online curated contents displaying tobacco products or their use. So everywhere when they use the word display, they have to give it the same meaning. And so.
But you can display and still allow skipping, no?
No, but then you are not displaying. Then you have added and another person has.
But look at this way, right? Sorry, I'm debating. You are displaying, but the user is skipping. How is it your problem?
No, because I allowed them to skip. So see, I'm like I said, this is this.
Let's say you allow forwarding. You don't disallow. You don't say, okay, like skip intro. You just allow them to forward.
I added or I inserted the health spot, but I didn't display it because it was in my control whether or not I would allow a person to skip or not skip it. See, YouTube has ads that you cannot skip. OTT platforms, when they're showing live content, have ads that you are not allowed to skip. So I have the ability to include something which a user will not be able to skip. So if the government does, or if a judicial body does want to take the argument that that display means a mandate, then that's how they would interpret it.
Gauri, do you agree?
When I go to the theater and those ad comes, I close my eyes. Okay. So I'm skipping it in a way, right? So can the regulator now come and stand next to me and say that don't close your eyes? I mean, come on.
So I used to go to I used to walk in late. But what's the level of compliance on TV, Gauri, right now?
So Nikhil, I'm not, there is a 2017 report which basically, looked at this. I'm not aware, whether there has been any recent report, but at least the 2017 report did call out that there has not been full compliance of the rules. Thereafter, whether the industry has taken cognizance and in full compliance or not, we really need to see whether there can be another survey. But I would have another survey to actually check the effectiveness rather than, the compliance. But I'm not honestly aware after 2017 what is the status.
Arun mentioned this thing about the show that has some episodes which are an hour long, some episodes which are like, and that's real great creative freedom that someone might have. Do you think there is, and just so every one of you, do you have ideas on how one could bring in proportionality in terms of disclaimers, if at all, where, let's say, depending on the amount of content, there is going to be something, and there's going to be a particular number of seconds, etc. How would you change this for, like, this has clearly been written for television and cinema. How would you make it relevant for OTT?
I think if I can go first, see, they already have some concept, which is the descriptors, right, on the top, right? And the point that is being made, there are, translations coming below and things like that. So if the age rating is already 16 and 18 plus, right? So that is basically, that is one element. And when you have it, that descriptor that comes on the top, if that can be used to give, right in the beginning that, okay, smoking, into bracket, some description to say injurious or whatever it may be. So it will have lesser, disruption, though, according to Arun, it can all be managed. But I'm just saying from even like smaller platforms, they have to adopt technology. So if that can be used, that ultimately you're wanting to inform the consumer, right? Now, if that and the initial disclaimers or whatever, I'm not speaking for the industry. They may come back and tell me, no, even that we know it's too much. But I'm just saying that initial disclaimer and the descriptors, I think that could be less disruptive, but at least trying to achieve the objective. Though ultimately, I'm not sure about the objective gets achieved or not. But at least that could be less disruptive.
Well, let's face it. We have ministries now that don't like taking a step back, and so you have to give them an honorable way of changing these regulations. Maybe like we've seen with the certain rules last year, like the RBI and data localization, and like MeitY under Mr. Maheshwari, you could have a FAQs that basically roll back some things in it. So, Savni, what would you do?
So,
what is an acceptable outcome?
Yeah, I do agree with Gauri that when you have, so the intention of the age ratings and the content descriptors was to give a fair warning to people before they start watching content. That was the thread that was built into the media code, that this will give a fair warning to people before they start watching a content, that what is within the content. Now, the point where I disagree is, when you start putting disclaimers on the content descriptors, somebody might come and say, no, this says racism or sex, and sex is bad in the Indian society. So put a bracket and say that that's also bad. Maybe where we can find a middle ground, which also achieves what Gauri was saying, was that not all, but some content already comes with a disclaimer for various socio-political reasons. They already come with disclaimers. Something like that, maybe, which in that disclaimer includes an anti-smoking, which I have a feeling they already do include in most cases. So something like that. But like you say, we need to find an honorable sort of way to make this what we have work. We, as much as our wish list could say that we wish this away, it wouldn't happen. So something which definitely excludes certain kinds of content, So maybe old content, we've just seen all the OTT players invest about a year and a half into adding content descriptors to the vast libraries that they have. So something that
Year and a half. So this timeline is clearly not working, right? Like Arun said.
Yeah, and I mean, all of this happened a year and a half ago, so it's been a process for them already. And similarly, when you talk about foreign content, see, it's possible when you talk about artists and creative persons, they may actually want to pull their content away because they don't want to be subject to these sort of disclaimers, etc. So somewhere where there are some exclusions that maybe these FAQs that we talk about, there's some clarity that's put with respect to that sort of content.
Arun, has there been content which has not been displayed in India because of regulations?
Not that I'm aware, because the response would essentially be that you don't buy that piece of content, right? For instance, nobody is buying the documentary on Ravish Kumar while we watched. And the makers have made it pretty clear that nobody wants to touch this with a 10-foot pole. Similarly, when Mubi bought Sexy Durga, they bought the CBFC cut version that was, fairly altered in its final form. And just to kind of also respond to the middle ground part, there is a middle ground that I am particularly fearing might happen, which is that all film content will be replaced with a CBFC cut, because those cuts already have those warnings in place in the beginning and then the middle. They are completely compliant, and we will suddenly have a situation where the Central Board of Film Certification, thanks to the Health Ministry of all things, surges in its influence over the kind of content we can watch anywhere in the country, whether it's on TV, whether it's on OTT, whether it's on in cinemas. And there's been a very small, regrettably small trend of some films coming out in their uncut form without CBFC interference, and this could hit an end to that if that kind of middle ground for some content is possible. So I just wanted to flag that as a real danger that we might have.
Well, I'll give you one example. In 2013, Woody Allen decided not to release Blue Jasmine in India because of the Indian government's requirement for running an anti-smoking ad concurrently with smoking on screen. So there's at least one example of something not being released.
So Nikhil, I'm wondering, the mention of those high court cases which are pending, if the current rules also are challenged and we, sort of revive those pending petitions, at least try to, once again reiterate before the courts. But I'm not sure, how much urgency will the courts show for these type of issues when they have so many other, things to look at. But at least an attempt could be made to at least request the court to look into the constitutionality and ultra virus issues that I brought out in the beginning, in parallel, to the conversations with the ministries, because somewhere whether that act is constitutional or not itself is a pending issue. And unfortunately, when the act and the rules are questioned and you keep making amendments to that and the matter is still pending before the court, that is where I feel there is a failure in the overall system. And if one can try to sort of also do that in parallel in addition to all the points that we have mentioned.
Do you think there's appetite in streaming services to go to court?
That I'm not sure. I'm just, because they have not
My guess
challenged
is
the
no.
IT rules. The
I
IT
know.
rules have not been challenged, right? So though the news agencies have, but anyway, so I'm just saying that because this is an industry issue for a media industry. It's not just, let me also talk from a producer's perspective. For example, in a Anurag Kashyap matter or in a Mahesh Bhatt matter, it is not the television channels did not go to the court. It were the producers that went to the court. It is equally an important issue for creators, right? So I'm just talking from an industry perspective. If there is an appetite to sort of go to the court, at least to test, the position of law, because ultimately, otherwise, these delegated legislations and all that, unfortunately, that's the way the government functions. That is where the challenge is for the industry, and especially on the ease of doing business stories and all of that, right? This is not falling into that scheme.
So I have two quick questions here. One is the impact on global streaming service providers, right? Will they have to comply? So for example, if I'm a German citizen living in India, subscribing to a German streaming service, or let's say Arun subscribes to, as an Indian citizen, subscribes to a French streaming service. Savni, will it impact global service providers, or will they be banned or something?
That's possible, right? The argument that's always taken kind of goes back to the Legal Meteorology Act, where they say if you're importing food products, they have to have MRPs, and so if you want to sell it in the Indian market, put a label on it and then sell it. So definitely that's something that's possible. I mean, I don't know if they'll ban them, but they will try, I think, seek to implement the laws to them. I don't know if they'll be able to enforce it though.
There's one other thing, right, about the audio visual element. So does this impact audio podcasts as well, where someone might mention smoking? How do you, will they be required to put audio disclaimers? Because is audio visual like audio or visual, or both audio and visual? How does this work?
Yeah, I think
Because it includes podcasts in that list. So I'm just wondering.
yes. So I mean, I think the reading would be that you'd have to include audio disclaimers and audio health warnings when you talk about podcasts to give meaningful interpretation to a beneficial legislation. But I see why you bring that up, because
If I do a podcast on the ill effects of smoking, where I'm discussing it for an hour, then I will have to, every time I mention the word smoking, I'll have to keep giving disclaimers.
yeah, no, but you're not I mean,
After every sentence, there'll have to be a disclaimer.
yeah, so you probably would have to comply with the health. I mean, I don't know how you'll comply with the health spots though, because those are provided by the government. You might be able to comply with the audio-visual disclaimer, the audio-only part of it. Maybe you can skip the health warning because you're not actually displaying the tobacco product or their use in the program. So arguably, you could get away with just just an
I mean,
audio.
basically, why is the word podcasts even there? It's just copy pasted from the IT rules, is it?
I mean, as I said in the beginning, this seems like they've taken some provision from the old rules and some provisions from the IT rules, existing IT rules, and created something one pager.
Gauri, can the health ministry override MIB's guidelines? Like, is there a conflict between these rules, or is there potential for conflict with between rules in the future sometime? Like,
So the way I'm looking at this, one is from a legality perspective, right? If what I said before, assuming, they have the power, let's say under Constitution and AOBR and all of that, then there from a legal perspective, there would not be a conflict because there is no contradiction out here because and the same thing happened, for example, as Arun said before, in television, right? So MIB has a licensing power, right? They do have advertising and content code, but even then, health ministry that time also did come up with these requirements for the television channel, right? So the same thing has happened today. I will answer this more from a ease of doing business story and not so much from a legal perspective, because legally I don't see that that there is the challenge other than the constitutional issue which I mentioned. If that is taken care of, assuming, then there is no legal issue on overlap. But the question is more from a ease of doing business, and there I feel the ministry collaboration, as Mr. Maheshwari was saying before, would have been ideal. There should have been conversations. They could have told the ministry that, okay, you already have these rules. Why not, try to add some other elements to your rules? Let us see the effectiveness. And then we'll see if something more is required. Even today, they can do that, right? To say that, okay, we'll stay our hands. These are the changes you make in your rules, which are reasonable. And then we will see the effectiveness. Then we will decide whether to still implement this or not, etc.
so how do you prevent different ministries from jumping up and saying, okay, there's drug abuse, prevent that. There is animal cruelty, prevent that.
I completely agree.
Violence
Nikhil,
against women, prevent that. Like, everyone's going to jump up and say, put this disclaimer.
No, but if you remember, so Nikhil, if you remember, and this is something the ministry, MIB has said in open forum, so I'm able to repeat this here, right? When the NCPCR started to, starting to intervene in some of the content for the online platforms, MIB stepped in to say that no, now we are taking control of the rules. We are the proper ministry, right? And we will handle this from a content side, right? And they sort of were able to sort of stop NCPCR from sort of intervening in the matter. So that is where you need the ministries to sort of tell each other. But this should have happened before, not after.
Because
Yeah.
in the separation in the separation of jurisdiction or rules that MeitY had done 2.5 years ago or 3 years ago, they gave that part to MIB.
Correct.
But
Correct.
I'm just saying, but the other counterpoint is that Ministry of Health and Family Welfare actually has a law backing the rules to some extent, whereas MIB has nothing.
Yeah.
There is no law backing MIB's regulation.
I agree. Yeah,
of streaming services, right? So maybe they're on shakier ground, but I don't see the ministries taking each other to court.
And if you see, I hope so. I hope that happens. But in the past, when the television thing happened, that is exactly what happened between the two ministries. I think if that time it's a published report which says that PMO had to intervene that time, even when the same thing happened for television. There were some amendments made, if not everything, but some amendments were made for the old content and things like that, right? But but here also, whether there is such intervention, and then there is some conversation we need to see. But as you rightly said, once it is out, then to say take 2 steps back in an election year, let's see, whether they're able to really do that.
So I have another sort of outlier question, like exception situation, Savni. Now that we're regulating private viewing here, right, and OCCPs and streaming services are clearly not broadcast. If, let's say, I have a personal Google Photos library and someone's smoking there, right? Or let's say there is someone sharing a video of someone smoking in a WhatsApp group, will that, like, you're clearly regulating private viewing here. How is that also, can that also be affected by these rules?
Not these rules, and the reason.
But new rules, because now that jurisdictionally it's been established that you can regulate private viewing, whether it is through the IT rules 2020 or these rules, they can go anywhere, right?
Yeah, so I think whether or not they do it with a brand new set of rules, that would be pure conjecture. I don't know how they'd make the rules that
My question is, can they? Because now has jurisdictional precedence been established for it? If they want to, can they do it?
See, this is not new jurisdictional precedence, no? This is not the first time that this has happened. So,
this is the second time that private viewing has been regulated, no?
Yeah, so layers to your question, can it be done through these? No, these are with respect to publishers of online curated content. Can they make rules in general under the act, the parent act for these COTPA rules? Probably they can. Whether they will sustain a challenge, whether those are more likely to be challenged than these rules, maybe because there you're talking about a private citizen being affected by a government action, by a state action. And so maybe challenge under fundamental rights can come in, which a company here may not take up. And finally, whether those would sustain that challenge would depend completely. Right now, I can't think of a way that they could draft those rules which would.
They can't. But I'm just going back to Arun's point about that personal, that private versus public needs to be explored more.
Yeah, probably. But yes, I guess.
So I'm just curious, and anyone wants to take this up, like how are freemium models impacted, right? So let's say if I'm running a show, like if I'm running a show purely on YouTube, but I'm monetizing it via ads, like TVS Pictures ran some shows where they put a few episodes up, and then, or if I'm, let's say, like Alt Balaji did with many shows initially, they would put up 2 episodes for free on YouTube and say, subscribe to our service to watch the rest, right? So then that's basically the rules apply to systematic business professional or commercial activity, right? So freemium models, ads are all commercial activities. So will they apply to that kind of content also? Like will altpology, let's say there's a show called Dave Double D. I remember a couple of friends of mine had written, and that had smoking in the first sort of, it would have had smoking in the first episode. And so will you, if these content providers put the first 2 episodes on YouTube as well, will they have to include like a 30-second audio-visual health spot or something?
If I could just start off on this answer, especially because Prateek Singh has also asked a similar question in the chat directed to me. See, I think let's take it a step further, and maybe that's something that we touched upon but didn't really delve into earlier in our discussion. The practical aspect of these rules also extends beyond just apply whether or not it's possible to add these disclaimers to existing content, volume of content, etc. Because what we're talking about is treating content differently, because when it comes to sort of OTT content, there as Nikhil you said, one would have to see these disclaimers, but when it comes on YouTube, you wouldn't need to see these disclaimers. Similarly, this in my opinion, this does impact an OTT company's business model, because you're trying to sell a premium sort of service for a price to your consumers, saying you watch content without ads. Yet you are subjected to these health spots, which I mean, God only knows how many times you'll have to watch that health spot for a 20-minute episode or a 1-hour episode. So I think that's another practical aspect that has not been considered when they came out with these rules.
Yeah, this is what happens when you don't do consultations. Gauri or Arun, either of you?
Yeah, so if you see the definition, of the publisher of online curated content, which is same as IT rules, they simply say by whatever name, they basically say means so and so, which is which says that over the internet or computer networks and such other entity by whatever name called. So they really are not making distinction with respect to where you are publishing, either it is your own platform or internet. Right, so which will include your intermediaries and all of that, right? So that is where you're a publisher. What they're
So,
excluding,
hold on. So do these guidelines apply to intermediaries?
not to intermediaries, publisher on the intermediary platform.
On the intermediary
right?
platform.
So
Okay.
in my mind, they do apply to a publisher on an intermediary platform, and then they are not making distinction when you're a publisher, right? Whether it is commercial or non-commercial, except when they go at the individual level. Only there they make a distinction that if you're an individual user, right?
Correct.
They say, but does not include any individual or user who is not transmitting over the content so and so for in a systematic, professional, commercial activity, whatever.
So let's
if
say
you are otherwise a business as a publisher over any intermediary platform, it's not the intermediary that have to comply, but as a publisher, it is your responsibility to comply. That's the way I'm reading this.
So which means that, let's say if I run an MCN on YouTube, like a multi-channel network, and let's say I build a network of travel bloggers, and some of those travel bloggers are smoking, and I'm monetizing that through brand placements and running ads, etc. Then effectively, as a publisher,
I'll have to do all this.
I'll have to do all of this on YouTube as well.
As a publisher, yes. I just want to be very clear. Yes.
Yeah,
Because
as a
if
publisher,
you,
I'm
yeah,
running a
because
multi-channel.
they have
I'm
not
running
given
a-
any, because they have just copy pasted the definition, right? And that is how the definition reads. And at a publisher level, unless you're an individual, etc., right? There, if you're not that, if you're a publisher, right? Whether you are able to monetize or not monetize is not the point. You're a publisher who's not a user, individual. Then this applies to you. That's the way I'm reading it, because it says internet or computer networks.
So let's say and Savni or Arun, if I create a short 10-minute film, Hotstar picks it up for their Hotstar shorts, and it has someone smoking, and it runs on Hotstar, and therefore that will carry the disclaimers. And then if I take the same piece of content and let's say I have a non-exclusive arrangement with Hotstar and I publish it for free on YouTube, will I have to, will the same content be treated differently depending on whether it's on YouTube or it's on Hotstar?
I think it will, right?
It will, and there is also a basis to do that because the very nature of curation is that you have a limited range of content to pick from as a user, and obviously there's capacity issues also. Tomorrow, who knows? Maybe we will very well see in 3 years they'll tell YouTube to apply AI to detect cigarettes automatically in shots and apply such warnings. It's
Man, that's a slippery slope. So then every little thing there will be something.
The slippery slope started in 2021. We are currently skiing rapidly down it.
2020.
Yeah. So yeah. So there is also this basis for consult. And so one thing that I really want to talk about is that before you do a consultation, you need to answer a few basic questions like who do I do this consultation with? What do I do with this consultation? Now, I question the very basis of streaming services as a category of players being a part of the tobacco control regime. Maybe producers come together and say, okay, depiction of smoking is out of control on media. What should we do? Okay, give us tax breaks for tobacco-free content. Cool. Those are nice kind of discussions to have. Those have basis because you are reducing the overall cultural influence of tobacco. But then you say, okay, I will go directly to the streaming service, and what will we talk about, right? Because the content is made, it's done, it's already on the table. So essentially, they already had a objective, which is that you add some warnings on content.
I actually don't understand the point.
The point is, if you're a streaming service, your usefulness in a public health discussion is limited by the very nature of you being someone who takes finished content and also some content that you yourself make and then pass it forward, right? In originals, that might be difficult to do. But if you're a producer, if you're the entire Hollywood industry coming together and saying, hey, we will reduce smoking scenes in movies going forward, that is a valid way to conduct your regulatory whatever discussions with people. But if you're doing it with a streaming player, then what legitimate goals do you have there? Because if you're saying add warnings here, do they help? That is something you need to figure out beforehand. With cinema, you have a 10-year time gap where you had the best conditions. I'm still not convinced that it is possible to measure the effectiveness of these warnings in theaters. Maybe there is some justification on cigarette boxes and in places where cigarettes are sold. But we had 10 years to do this, and there is no convincing study. And this is the only country. So there was actually incentive for researchers from all over the world to come here and see how it has been playing out. That has not happened. So now
why don't we see anti-tobacco ads in school textbooks?
Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
So you need to go where the people are, where the intrusion is low, where the potential for success is high, right? With tobacco boxes, fully on board. Even the tobacco industry fought back against that, and then they eventually relented, but that's a different story, right? So it's just a very clumsy way of conducting something like this. It almost feels like 2 days before World Tobacco Action Day, they were like, "Yaar, kuch karna padega," and then they came and said, "Oh, this has been pending for 2 years."
There's clearly been work behind this. There were, as was shown in the presentation before, that 2022 there was a report as well. But so for Gauri and Shavni, what happens when someone doesn't comply with these regulations?
That's an interesting question, and if you really see, the it doesn't talk to the main act, right? In the main act, there is a provision anti-advertising, right? And then it talks about violation of that anti-advertising provision. But at least I have not come across when the rules are violated, what happens in the main act, right? So in the main act, if it is if this use is treated as advertising, which according to me it is not, if they treat that as advertising, then there is a penal provision in the main act, right? So unless, as Shravani had pointed out initially, there was a copy paste that there is some committee and they will do this and that. But so this is more of censure and things like that, order to revise, etc. But there is no, luckily, I don't see there is a penal sanction under the main act, because there is no because it is ultra virus. Obviously, the main act doesn't talk about any penal sanctions or otherwise for the violation of these rules.
Sami?
Yeah, I think the only thing to add here is if, which Gauri's already covered, if one is to consider these as advertisements and then read this in consonance with the act, because when you look at the previous rules also, those also were simply made under section 31, which is which is what is in these rules as well. That's section 31, the general provision, rulemaking provision. Now, that general rulemaking provision, if you read with section 5, which talks about advertisement, then you will say, okay, because we will extend the non-compliance or non-compliance of these rules to the penal provisions in the act and take it like that. But there are many ifs before you reach that conclusion.
There's a question from Pratik for you, Savni, and I was showing non-skippable health warnings, which you equated with non-skippable YouTube ads or ads during sports events, play out for OTT's companies' business model. They're selling the no ads plans at a premium, and more players are offering, and other players are offering with ad cheaper plans.
Yeah, I think I tried to touch upon this in the previous comment that I was making. Basically, I mean, there is an impact. You're treating content which is available on, say, user-generated platform differently from content which is on OTT platform, and in a manner that creates an absurdity in the situation. And you're taking it one step further, where you're saying that this kind of goes against the business models that OTTs have developed over the past so many years, and it will impact the kind of premium that they're able to charge. If we were to say that these will be non-skippable health spots, and I really have to, so I can't monetize it, or I am offering it to my customers saying I'm not monetizing this your subscription with ads, yet your subscribers and users are subject to these interruptions in their viewing experience.
There's a question from Dhaval on who will take on the liability if this published content is put by a user on an intermediary platform. Anyone? So, like we said, is it going to be like if, let's say, Alt Balaji puts two episodes on, or TVF puts 2 episodes on YouTube with smoking without any warnings as such, will the liability be just of TVF or Alt Balaji, or will it also be of the intermediary platform?
In my view, not of intermediary platform, but I think the question was more to do with the individual. So just to distinguish once again, publisher, is a so they are sort of publishing curated content, and they have a higher liability of what we spoke just now through this through this webinar. But a user who's not conducting a commercial activity, to put it simply, like user like you and me, if we put some content, the regulations don't apply. So I thought I'll just clarify that part. But if I'm if I'm somebody who's an individual publisher and I continuously am posting content for a business or a commercial activity, just as Nikhil said, I'm deriving, say, ad revenue through YouTube, and this is my, it's an evidence-based, fact finding, whether it is my business activity. If so, then I'm liable.
There's a comment from an anonymous attendee who says that at the point of tobacco warnings being effective at the point of sale or on tobacco products. Governments globally benchmarked Global Audit Tobacco Survey in 2016-17. This is the last available such survey, shows that almost 62% of the adults who consume tobacco thought of quitting after looking at the warning on labels. So there's evidence that warnings are effective in positively influencing behavior. Again, the question is about whether they're effective when they're on a label, or whether they're effective on streaming services, or effective in theaters. So I guess you need to judge each medium differently as well, right? Where is it most effective? Probably, I would guess, at the point of sale. Great. I was just wondering if whether you guys have any wish list about what you'd like to see happen from here on. Start with you, Arun. And you have your hand raised. So, is there any point that you wanted to make?
No, let's go point more of a question. Maybe this can come up with the wish list. Is
first the question will end with
Sure.
the wish list.
Sure. So my question is, will there? So Nikhil, you spoke about graceful out, basically an off ramp for the MOHFW to get out of this. So I'm just wondering, Gauri or Sabir, for either of you, can the Committee on Subordinate Legislation put a cap on this and be like, okay, we'll come back to this later and effectively stall its implementation? Is that something that is within the realm of possibility?
Does anyone know what happened with the Committee on Subordinate Legislation on the IT rules? I think they were supposed to meet on the rules in March or something. We don't know what's happened there, right?
I think the way they can probably do is, extend the timeline of compliance maybe by another, few months. In the meantime, revisit the rules where, sort of people would have forgotten about this. And then revisit the rules and amend and, come with a new avatar. That could be.
FAQs, Gauri, FAQs. I'm a big fan of FAQs.
But FAQ there is no vagueness here, unfortunately. They exactly know the 3-second here and there.
Even if there's no vagueness, there are FAQs, and then on the line, on the top of that document, there's a line that says these are not legally binding.
Yeah. Or my solution is to extend the timeline for compliance by 200 years.
Yes, totally.
Savni, anything on this?
No, I don't think there's anything to add on it. I think
No outs for you?
so sure. I mean, I'd have to agree with Gauri. It needs a revisit if at all something has to happen. FAQ may actually not help out in this particular case.
Okay, well, FAQs have changed the rules, even if they say that they're not changing the rules. We've seen that in the past.
But that also have FAQs and then clarifications and then FAQs on the clarifications.
So, wish list. Arun, you want to go first?
I mean, my wish list is that IT rules itself get revoked and we become a perfect democracy. But in the realm of the possible, I would like to see that, of course, that the health ministry extend the timeline, also give them a start talking to the OTTs, because to this day, I think the conversations between the two parties have not been very meaningful, if they have been happening at all. And to also review the literature of just how effective these warnings are more carefully and more pragmatically before moving forward with them. The study that was cited by one of the people who questioned it. Again, this is something that's wrong with studies that come from the industry, that come from the government, right? They're going to take polar opposite stands. I think the Cohen study, which is very extensive, also suffers from the proximity to industry, and the study that was cited by the person in the audience, that was conducted under the supervision of the health ministry and the India WHO office. So I think we need to, if we can't get enough evidence, I think we should hold off on news where public health interventions don't have an obvious route. So, and also the greater insistence on the public-private viewing jurisprudence, that would be great to have, because it could benefit the OTT industry and viewers in other ways also.
Gauri?
Yeah, so I feel there has to be definitely a complete revisit on this overall approach, where there is an interference in the on the content level, right? Because whether that is effective in the first place, some survey empirical data needs to be done in parallel. Secondly, as I mentioned in the NEP, they already are talking about at the school level what can be done briefly. So I think some other approaches, and I just want to give one example, right? Like yesterday, my son, started his internship, and he was asked by his seniors and in legal field. So, do you drink or smoke, right? And when he came and told me this, I said, and he told me, I'm so happy that, since childhood, you sort of cultivated that in me that I should not, this just happened yesterday, right? You
Hmm.
cultivated that I should not be smoking and drinking, right? So the point I'm trying to make here, the government tries to adopt a big daddy approach, and try to
Nanny state.
intervene, right? And intervene in each and every aspect of our life. Let us work at the societal level rather than at a regulation level. Can we do something more at the societal level? Let's creatively think that. Even I, request the creative community to come up with some suggestions. And there has to be a complete revisit, to say that this is the only way to address the problem. No, there can be some other ways to address the problem. So let us evaluate those other ways to address the problem, right? More, as Arup said, why not to speak more in your education material or otherwise? Catch them young. You're trying to catch them when they are already 13 plus, 16 plus. Catch them young, cultivate that. I think, and that is where we see, need more work, because I don't see, honestly, I have not seen data to say that this is helping. And we want to see whether it is helping or not. And basis that, a new approach can be probably adopted.
Savni?
See, they're catching them young because technically, if Tom and Jerry, Tom smokes a cigarette after being frustrated by Jerry, they're still going to have a health warning and a health spot before, between, and after that cartoon episode. So they are trying to catch them young. um, but on a more serious note, if I mean, a wish list here would definitely be a revamp of these rules, and a hard look at what is the objective and what is the proportional step that can be taken to achieve that objective. If the Ministry of Health wants to come out with rules, and if those rules have to do with OTT, then let the ministry speak to the industry members, to the industry players. Let them also evaluate how this would work out with the existing content descriptors, age rating that the OTT players are already using. If they can build upon that, if that turns out to be enough, or if instead of having all three that they've put on theaters, which is health spot, health warning, and a static message, simply a static message is sufficient, if that is even practical and if that is even implementable. Something which has a little bit more analysis of what the industry works like and how the industry players work, like how content actually on the internet actually works, and then some new sort of rules that will help actually achieve the objective they are trying to achieve.
So my wish list is to start off with, if any kind of regulations have to be made applicable, they should be made applicable to new content being published, so as to ensure that it's not only the streaming services with deep pockets that can, and the ability to, rustle up an entire global network of translators and etc. that can that they have to so make it easier for people to implement by adding it to saying any regulation that comes in has to be applicable to new content. The second thing I would say is that effectively it should be that the warning should be in the language of the streaming service, in or the language chosen by the individual. Any warning that comes in. The third would be to revisit the entire process and do a full consultation, also involving public stakeholders, not just the industry, and then have a public open house sort of a discussion, so that all types of stakeholders can come in and represent their views, because clearly these are poorly thought out, because you can't have the same thing for a 5-minute shot and have it for a full 1 hour or 1.5 hours. So it can't be a one size fits all sort of a solution. And lastly, wait till you have legal safe ground for bringing out these regulations, because right now there is none. There is no law under which OCCPs are actually defined. So I would say hold off until you actually have a law that allows it, which might just happen with the Digital India Act.
Nikhil, I want to add to my wish list if that's okay.
Yeah.
So this wish list is to the industry. Please sue. I mean, I beg you to go to court, in the sense that restraint and like compliance is really not going to help you, because there will always be demands for more. Ullu, which you mentioned, Nikhil, I saw and looked into that case a little bit. Features, it's essentially a soft porn streaming service, soft erotica streaming.
Arun, I wouldn't say that on live
No.
stream.
You can cut it out, it's fine. And but they did show a certain level of restraint in the level of detail they were able to go to. And yet we saw that DPCGC has said that, okay, this is obscenity, take it down. So these are systems that you have been closely involved in creating and participating in, and yet they are kind of attacking at the foundations of some of your members. So some resistance that is more than just trying to align yourself with the government view might be in order. And that is, at least make a statement, say something in public, or ask viewers, would you be okay with this? And
there's also an interesting point, Arun, from Rohit in the comments, saying that in the US, the law allows foreign TV channels to be excluded from the mandatory subtitling in case the amount earned is less than a threshold. Perhaps foreign streaming services can also be exempt, otherwise they'll be banned, right? But great, thank you all for a fantastic discussion. Gauri, Savni, Arun, we will be reporting this on MediaNama, of course, and thanks to Mr. Maheshwari for being so candid with his views. We will be reporting this on MediaNama. We'll put together a report and also send it to the Ministry of Health. And the video of this discussion will be available online in case you wish to share it with anyone, in case anyone who's watching wants to revisit some parts of it. And I'd like to thank Vivan and Kwan for a tremendous amount of support in trying to put this together. Like the biggest challenge for us was to try and get content creators to talk, and all of us tried very hard. Hopefully, we will get content creators to talk separately about this issue in the next few weeks. But thank you all for your support. Thank you for joining. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Nikhil, for your excellent work for last 15, 16 years.
Thanks, Gauri.